She was standing at the front door when I pulled up, arms crossed, like she'd been waiting for me to make one wrong move. I hadn't even turned off the engine yet. My stepfather had been dead for 4 days. 4 days since I got the call at 2 in the morning, since I drove 3 hours through rain to get to the hospital, since I sat in a plastic chair outside a room and held my breath waiting for news that never came. 4 days since I'd cried in a parking garage so my younger half-sister wouldn't see me fall apart. And now here was my stepfather's sister, my Aunt Loretta, standing on the porch of the house I'd grown up in, telling me without saying a single word that I didn't belong here anymore. "The lawyer's coming at 11, she said when I got out of the car. "Family only." I almost laughed. "I am family." She looked at me the way people look at a receipt they're about to dispute. "Jerome has a specific list of people named in the will. Your name isn't on it." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Because Jerome, my stepfather, the man who'd raised me from the time I was 7 years old, who'd taught me to drive a stick shift in an empty parking lot, who'd called me son every day for 20 years, would never have done this. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my chest like a pulled thread unraveling. But Aunt Loretta was already holding the door half closed, and I didn't have the language for what I was feeling, so I just got back in my car. I sat there for a long time in the driveway, long enough to watch the lawyer arrive in a Navy Buick, long enough to watch my stepfather's brother, Clyde, shake the man's hand on the porch like they already knew each other well, long enough to understand that whatever was happening inside that house had been planned before Jerome ever got sick. Jerome had been a software engineer, not the splashy tech billionaire kind. He worked for a mid-sized firm in Cincinnati, had for almost 30 years, built something quiet and steady that I never fully appreciated until later. He owned the house outright. He had a retirement account, some investments, a small rental property in Dayton he'd bought in the 90s. Nothing flashy, but comfortable. The kind of wealth that takes a lifetime of discipline to build. I'd never thought about what happened to it when he died. I never had to. My mother had passed when I was 23, a few years after I'd gone off to college. Jerome and I had drifted some after that, the way people do when the person connecting them is gone. But he'd always called on my birthday, always asked how work was going. When I'd hit a rough patch 2 years ago, he was the one who'd quietly floated me enough to cover 2 months' rent without ever making me feel ashamed about it. He was a good man. That's the only way I can say it. So when my cousin, Clyde's son, a guy named Preston, who I'd maybe seen 6 times in my life, called me that evening to tell me Jerome had left everything to immediate family, I knew something was deeply wrong. "You weren't in his daily life," Preston said, and I could hear the practiced calm in his voice, the kind people use when they've rehearsed a conversation. "Jerome wanted his assets to go to people who were present. You understand. I was at the hospital," I said. "I was there when he died. That's not really the point." I asked to see the will. Preston said the lawyer had advised against sharing it until the estate was settled. I asked for the lawyer's name and number. Preston said he'd have to check on that. He never called back. For the next 2 weeks I was in a fog. I went to work. I managed inventory for a regional hardware chain. Nothing exciting. And I came home and I stared at my ceiling. I called a legal aid clinic and they told me contesting a will was expensive and complicated and I'd need proof of undue influence, not just a feeling. I called Jerome's old neighbor, a retired woman named Beverly, who'd watched me grow up, and she said she'd noticed people coming and going from the house in the weeks before Jerome went into the hospital. She didn't know who they were. Then, 3 weeks after Jerome's funeral, I found the letter. It had been sitting in my email drafts folder, of all places. Jerome had my email address. I'd helped him set up his phone once, years back, and apparently he'd sent a message to himself using my account by mistake, or maybe on purpose. I'll never know which. The subject line just said "for when." I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam. If you're reading this, something went wrong. I've been trying to talk to you directly, but things have moved faster than I expected, and I don't know how much time I have. There's a property in Harlan County, Kentucky, a farmhouse off Route 119, past the second cattle gate. I bought it in 2003 under a separate LLC. Nobody knows about it but you now. The deed and some other things you'll need are in the basement. The lockbox combination is your mother's birthday. Don't bring anyone with you. Don't tell Preston. I'm sorry I couldn't do this differently. Jai read it probably 15 times. Then I sat very still for a long time. Harlan County, Kentucky. That was almost 5 hours from Cincinnati. Jerome had family roots in eastern Kentucky. His grandparents had been coal country people. I knew that much, but I'd never heard him mention owning anything there. I hadn't even known he had a second LLC. Why would a man who worked in software engineering for 30 years quietly hold a property in the Appalachian foothills under a shell company and never mention it to anyone? I didn't sleep that night. By 4 in the morning, I was already in my car with a thermos of coffee and my phone GPS set for a town called Loyal, which was the closest named point I could find near where Jerome's directions led. The drive was strange. I went through Lexington as the sun came up, then south and east into a part of the state I'd never been, where the hills get steep and the trees come right to the edge of the road. The towns get smaller and farther apart. Gas stations with hand-lettered signs, churches on every other ridge. It has a kind of beauty that takes you by surprise, not the manicured, photographed kind, but something rawer and older, like the land doesn't care whether you appreciate it or not. I found the route Jerome had described. Past Loyal, off a state highway, through a hollow where the road turned to gravel. There were 2 cattle gates exactly where he said. I stopped at the second one and got out and just stood there for a minute, listening to nothing but wind in the trees and one distant creek. The farmhouse was about a quarter-mile in. It was smaller than I'd expected. A white clapboard house with a covered porch, maybe built in the 40s or 50s, the kind of place that's been in a family forever and shows it. The porch boards soft in places, the window trim needing paint, one shutter hanging at an angle. But it was standing. It wasn't rotting. Someone had kept the roof up, kept the gutters clear enough. Jerome, or someone he'd hired. I went around to the back like he'd written to do. The basement door was a metal hatch in the ground, old but not rusted shut. It took some pulling. Inside was a low concrete room with a bare bulb that still worked when I found the switch. Jerome must have kept the utilities on, and shelves of old mason jars, and a workbench and a water heater that had seen better days, and in the corner, under the workbench, a lockbox, steel, about the size of a shoebox. The combination was a 6-digit number, my mother's birthday, month, day, year. I put it in with shaking hands. It clicked open. Inside was a manila envelope, and inside the envelope were documents I had to sit down on the basement floor to read because my legs stopped working correctly. The first was a property deed. The farmhouse and 12 surrounding acres, held in an LLC Jerome had formed in 2003 under a name I didn't recognize, something with the word cardinal in it. My name was listed as the sole beneficiary of that LLC. The second was a handwritten letter, 4 pages, dated about 8 months earlier. I won't share every word of it. Some of it is too personal. But the shape of it was this. Jerome had known for almost 2 years that Clyde and Preston had been pressuring him. It had started small, visits that felt more like inspections, questions about his finances, suggestions that he really ought to have his affairs in order. Jerome had a health scare in his early 60s, high blood pressure, nothing immediately serious, but Clyde had used it as an opening. He'd introduced Jerome to an estate attorney, not the family's longtime lawyer, a new one, a man named Duvain who operated out of a glass front office in Blue Ash, and things had accelerated from there. Jerome wrote that he'd felt the walls closing. He'd started to understand that documents were being prepared that he hadn't fully reviewed. He'd tried to slow things down and found that suddenly people were always around him, that getting time alone to make a phone call was harder than it used to be. His handwriting got smaller and more careful as the letter went on, like he was trying to be precise. I am not sure how much of this is legal and how much isn't, he wrote. What I know is that I didn't write the will they'll be reading. I signed something. I won't pretend I didn't, but I signed it in a bad week when my blood pressure medication had been adjusted And I was not thinking clearly. Clyde was there. Duvain was there. I kept asking for more time to read, and Duvain kept saying it was standard language. He'd found a way to get one afternoon alone, told everyone he was going to a doctor's appointment, drove here instead. He'd updated the LLC paperwork himself, filed it through an online service, put my name on it. He didn't have the energy or the access to redo the main will, but he documented everything he could remember about what had happened. The third item in the box was a small digital voice recorder, old, the kind you'd use for meeting notes. Jerome had dated the recordings on a sticky note attached to the side. I sat in that basement for over an hour listening to them. The recordings weren't dramatic in the way you'd expect from something that changes everything. Jerome's voice was calm, even a little flat, the voice of a man who'd already processed his fear and come out the other side of it. He described conversations, repeated back what Clyde had said, what Duvain had said, dates and times and who had been in the room. There was one recording where you could actually hear Clyde in the background, suggesting that Jerome was getting forgetful and ought to let the professionals handle the details. Jerome had left the recorder running in his shirt pocket. There was a fourth item, a folded printout of financial records from Jerome's investment accounts, with certain transfers highlighted in yellow marker. About $180,000 moved into accounts I didn't recognize over the course of 14 months, in increments small enough that they wouldn't automatically trigger reporting flags. Jerome had written next to one of them, "I did not authorize this. I put everything back in the envelope with hands that had stopped shaking and started doing something steadier instead, something that felt more like purpose than panic." I locked the box. I took it with me. I drove back out to the highway and found a motel in Middlesbrough and sat on the bed and called a number I'd been given by the legal aid clinic, a pro bono attorney in Covington who specialized in estate disputes. Her name was Anna Vasquez, and she picked up on the third ring, which surprised me. I talked for 40 minutes. She didn't interrupt much. At the end, she said, "Can you get me those documents?" "Yes." "Can you get me those recordings?" "Yes." "Then come see me Monday morning." I drove home. I didn't tell anyone where I'd been. I took photographs of every document before I handed anything over. I made copies of the recordings. I put the copies in 3 different places. The following week was the hardest part, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. The estate was still in the processing phase. Clyde and Preston were moving forward with Duvan as if everything were already settled. I went to work. I ate food I barely tasted. I waited. Anna worked fast. She filed a motion to contest the will on the grounds of undue influence and potential cognitive impairment at signing. She subpoenaed the records from Duvan's office. She brought in a forensic accountant to look at the financial transfers Jerome had flagged. What came back was worse than I'd thought. Duvain had done this before, not with Jerome, with 2 other elderly clients in the past 6 years, both of whom had signed revised estate documents in circumstances that, when examined, looked uncomfortably similar. One of those cases had been settled quietly. The other was still technically open. The Ohio State Bar had a file on him that his firm had managed to keep from becoming public. And the $180,000, half of it had moved through an account associated with Preston. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because the legal process is slow and complicated, and it doesn't look like the movies. There wasn't a single dramatic courtroom moment. There were depositions and motions and weeks of waiting and a meeting with a prosecutor from the Hamilton County DA's office who asked me very careful questions in a very small room. But here is what I can tell you. Clyde resigned from the estate administration after Anna's filing made it clear what discovery would look like. Duvain surrendered his bar license as part of a negotiated agreement with the state bar. Civil proceedings are ongoing. Preston was charged with elder financial exploitation and wire fraud. He pled out. He's serving 27 months at a federal correctional facility in eastern Ohio. The original will, the one Jerome had actually drafted years ago with his longtime lawyer, before Clyde introduced Duvain, was located in the attorney's files, exactly where it had always been. Jerome had simply never told Clyde it existed, or that the lawyer still had a copy. In that will, he left me the house, the Cincinnati house, where I'd grown up. He left other things to other people. There were charitable donations, a bequest to his church, something for Beverly the neighbor, but the house was mine. I stood in the driveway of that house on a gray February morning after the court had validated the original will, and I just looked at it for a long time. The porch where I used to sit with my mother in the summers, the side yard where Jerome had set up a basketball hoop he was never quite tall enough to dunk on, the kitchen window where the light came through in the late afternoon and made everything look amber and slow. I didn't move in. I want to be honest about that. I thought I would, but when it came to it, I couldn't. The house was full of things I wasn't ready to sort through, full of memories that needed more time before I could live inside them again. I sold it to a young couple who were starting a family. They had a little girl who was maybe 4, and when they toured the place, she ran from room to room like the house was already hers. I stood in the kitchen watching her and thought, okay, that's right. That's what a house like this is for. I took the proceeds and paid off my car and set aside a chunk for the legal fees that Anna's pro bono work hadn't covered and put the rest somewhere safe. The farmhouse in Harlan County I kept. I've been down 3 times since everything resolved. I hired a local contractor to fix the roof and shore up the porch, replace the worst of the windows. I'm not in a hurry. The place has waited this long. There's a ridge behind the property where you can see for miles on a clear day. Ridge after ridge after ridge going blue and pale into the distance, the way mountains do in that part of the country. Jerome had put a wooden bench up there at some point, weathered gray, nothing fancy. Just a place to sit and look. I sat there on my last visit until the light went low and the tree frogs started and the first stars came out. I thought about Jerome a lot. I thought about my mother and how she'd loved him and how good her judgment had always been about people. I thought about Preston in a facility in eastern Ohio, and about how greed has a way of shrinking the world around the people who choose it. Mostly I thought about the letter in the drafts folder. For when Jerome had trusted that I'd find it. He'd trusted me with the combination, with the truth of what had happened, with the work of setting it right. He'd done what he could with what he had, quietly, without anyone watching. That was the most him thing I can imagine. I go back to the farmhouse when I need to think. It's not fixed up enough to stay in for more than a night or 2 yet. But that's okay. I bring a sleeping bag and a cooler, and I sit on the porch in the morning with coffee and listen to the creek at the bottom of the hollow, and for a few hours the world gets very simple and very quiet. Jerome built something that lasted, in more ways than one. I'm still figuring out what to build with what he left me. But I have time now, and a place to do the thinking. That's enough to start.